One last thing I want to be sure you're familiar with is some of the database initialization features that CodeFirst provides. You've already seen a few of these in action. If the database didn't exist, CodeFirst created it for me. If you don't provide a connection string, which I haven't, it will use a default name following the strongly typed name of your context and create it in SQL Express. If you provide a database connection string, then CodeFirst will use that. But if the database in that connection string doesn't exist yet, CodeFirst will create it for you on the fly. This falls into the default strategy defined by the class createDatabaseIfNotExists. There are two others. One is dropCreateDatabase if model changes, which is shown here, and the last is dropCreateDatabaseAlways. While you're designing your app and your model is still in flux, you might prefer to use the drop create database if model changes strategy instead. So far, when I've modified the model, I've gone and deleted the database myself. If we let the default strategy do its job, I want you to see what would happen when I modify the model. I've added a new property to the blog class called dateCreated. I'll go ahead and run the application, and an exception is thrown. CodeFirst is aware of the fact that I've changed the model since the database was created. And since the model and the database don't align anymore, it throws this exception because it can't figure out the mappings. So while you're designing your app and your model is still in flux, you might prefer to use the drop create database if model changes strategy instead. That way, anytime you modify the model, CodeFirst will take care of deleting and recreating the database. A typical place to put the initializer is in application startup code. So in an ASP.NET Web application, you'll most likely want to put that into global ASAX. In this console application, I'll put it right into main as the first line of code that's hit when this application runs. The initializer is in the database class, and the database class is part of system.data.entity. And I'll say set initializer. I have to instantiate the new initializer and then tell it which one I want to use. And I want it to use drop create database if model changes. I also have to let it know which context class I want it to use. And I named my context class context, so I'll just put that in there. And we should be good to go. I'll go ahead and run the application again. And you can see now the blog table has the date created field. Now, one of the problems with dropping and creating the database anytime you need to do that is that if you have any data in there, you're going to lose it all. I happen to have this method to create a blog, but that means I would have to run that every time, and there's a better way. Instead, what we can do is seed the new database after it's created, and all of the initializers have this method seed, which is overridable. Let's take a look at how we can use that. I've got a new class here called myInitializer, and it inherits from the drop create database always strategy. And the reason I've chosen that is just for the sake of this demo. I don't want to have to modify the model again in order to trigger the initialization. So I'm going to use the initialization strategy that will recreate the database every single time. That way the initializer will get hit and the seed method will get called and we'll see the data go into the database. The way the seed method works is you need to create your objects and then add them to your context and then call the base seed method. The base seed method will call save changes on the context. So every time that database is initialized, seed will automatically get called and this data will get pushed into the new database. Another important piece of this is back in the program where I'm setting the initializer, I now need to set the initializer to my custom initializer. And notice I'm not passing the context in. The initializer class takes care of that for me. So I'll go ahead and run this one last time. And I've gone all the way through. And looking at the raw data in the database, you can see that my 3 blogs that I created in the seed method are there, followed by the one that was created by the add blog method.